when we begin to get our ideas for ourselves, that we begin to realize that I no longer lean into my parents, but I begin to lean into God because He has purpose for my life. We can act good in all the right situations, but when our buttons get pushed, it's out of the heart. Now I begin to look at it, well, it may not be that person at all. There's probably something in me. He was able to act like himself. In the middle of being beat, in the middle of being crucified, he was able to say, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening, Josh. Glad that everybody is here. Last week, we spent quite a bit of time talking about wounds, woundedness, and how these things affect our life. And it is really part of what I would consider foundational things that we really need to acknowledge, we need to talk about if we ever really expect to find true freedom, and true freedom that I would call lasting freedom that can only be found in Jesus. And so tonight, I wanted to follow up with that, and I want to talk about this idea of strongholds in our life. And I know that that we hear about strongholds because of the type of ministry we're in, and we have had all these vices and addictions, drugs, alcohol, sex, eating, anger, codependency, whatever you want to call it. We've all been bound up with a lot of these different things, and we end up defining them as strongholds. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time in just talking about what are strongholds. And, you know, from a biblical standpoint, when you look at strongholds, and they're mentioned all throughout the Old Testament, and you see them a little bit of the word used in some of the New Testament, but stronghold was this big fortress that was built. And a lot of times it was built high on a hill, and it had very tall walls, and you had to really ascend and hills to get to it, and it took a lot to get inside of there. And the purpose of that was to protect the people and to keep the enemy out. And so, you know, you can go back through all those books that are in the Old Testament, and you can find all kind of different references to strongholds, and God is even referred to as, you know, He's our strong tower. And David wrote a lot in the Psalms that he wanted Him to be His stronghold, and He was His stronghold, His protector. And so, but yet we get these things that's going on in our life, and they take hold of us. And how do we deal with them? And how do we even define them, what they are? And so one thing I want us to look at as we go through here and begin to realize that these strongholds, many times, and I did a teaching sometime back on temptation and some things like that, where I tried to show that a lot of credit gets given to Satan or the enemy or darkness, and in a lot of cases it really has nothing to do with him at all. And so many times we give too much credit, I believe, to the enemy when maybe we may just be battling our flesh. And so strongholds, I would start out by saying that they are not always demonic. And the majority of what I'm talking about tonight, you've got a handout there, and it has a reference at the bottom. And Jack Frost is a person that I love to listen to a lot of his teachings. He's got some great stuff, and this is adapted from his teaching called Breaking Free. Part of it is, and part of it is from some of the things I learned from Deeper Walk International. Marcus Warner, you know, he's been here, and so it's things that have really helped me grow along the way. And so the handout you have, I'm going to go through it here, part of it in a PowerPoint display, and I'm going to define what Jack Frost, he set out as this cycle of pain. And he didn't have the diagram, but I'm a very visual person, and so as he began to describe that in his teaching, Breaking Free, it's Shiloh Place Ministries, .org if you're interested. But as he began to describe that, I began to write that down in my mind, and then I put it on paper, and then I put it on a computer so that I could see it. And I'll just kind of share with you a little bit about this and what I've learned. I hope it'll be helpful to us all. So anyway, if you look at, let me back up here just one time. I mean, if we start out, and if we could just use the heart, for instance, because we know, the Bible and a lot of the writers, they refer to like it's the heart. That's where is our innermost being, and that's where, even though we have a brain, a lot of our ideas really develop from our deep and inner being. And so if we could picture, even though we know that we were born as sinners with the sinful nature, but if we could just picture that, in our mind, at least we had a kind of a clean slate when we started. Other than we, were born with the sin nature, at least we hadn't been totally corrupted with addictions and strongholds and all those type things. And so you just kind of get the picture there that we had a pure heart, as pure as it could be in the human life, and being born brand new baby, no sin yet, no rebellion, all those other things. And so what he talked about is that, every one of us as children, and we touched on this a little bit last week, that there's at least 4 basic needs that we need growing up. And I would just stress that I believe that last week and this week is some of the most important ideas that I could put out to explain to you how God has healed me and how the things I believe he's taught me really relate in these 2 teachings that I'm sharing with you. And so if we get anything, that we could just pay attention and at least give this a little bit of thought. And I would even go on to add that the ideas that I'm talking about tonight, I mean, even if you're not a follower of Jesus, if you're not a Christian, these ideas and these things I'm talking about could still make a difference in your life if you're willing to dig in and look at these things that we're going to be talking about. And so as children, he defined that there's 4 basic needs that we all need. We need unconditional expressed love. And see, for most of us, we probably don't really understand what unconditional expressed love is. And so you got to spend time thinking about each one of these things. For instance, I mean, most of the love, in a lot of our cases, we love conditionally. I love you if you behave a certain way, if you act a certain way, or maybe our parents or grandparents or somebody has modeled that, or a spouse or a relationship we've been in, but it seems like as long as we're performing a certain way, we're loved. And if we get outside of those boundaries, then we're not necessarily loved. But see, every child needs to grow up understanding that we're unconditionally loved and have that love expressed in a family situation. And then that leads to that we should grow up in a safe environment. And so many of us, if we were point blank asked and say, was our home a safe environment? And a lot of the stories I hear from people who share their story through the ministry of CF and on and on and on, they get to this point that maybe there was craziness in the family growing up. And home was not always the safest place to be. In other words, you didn't know maybe if there was a raging alcoholic father that was going to be there, or if he was even going to be there at all, or if a mother was schizophrenic, or all these different things. Some close friends of mine, when he grew up in his family, he's told Clarissa and I stories of how his father used to line all the children up on the couch, and he would take a pistol and he would shoot right above their head and just shoot holes in the wall. And so home was not a safe place for him. And so for many of us, we may or may not have grown up in a safe atmosphere. It may not have been secure. I've seen stories on the news recently where a guy was arrested because the child was just out wandering in the streets. And the parent was just almost OD'd on drugs. And finally, when they found him, they took the child away. So it was not a safe place for that child. And we need to be comforted. It should be safe, secure, and a place where we feel comfort. And even in our life today, we should challenge ourselves to think, do we have a safe place that we can run to? Whether it's our bedroom, wherever. What is our safe place that we run to? There was a point in my life that where I was so dysfunctional in my marriage and I was so miserable that I dreaded going home. And it was as much my fault as it was anybody else. And you've heard me talk about my dysfunction time and time again. But my work became my safe place. And that led into a stronghold or an addiction of workaholism. I would work late hours. I would go in on the weekends because I felt safer at home. Not that I was being abused at home or anything like that in my marriage, but just this stuff that was going on in turmoil in my mind. I felt safer when I could go away and work. And that turned into a stronghold for me. We grow up in atmospheres where we need to receive praise. I mean, how many of us, we hear stories time and time again, I was never praised. No one ever said, great job. I shared with you last week when I wanted to hear my father say, I'm proud of you, or I love you, and I didn't hear those words. I had great parents, and they loved me, and they nurtured me the best they knew how, but I missed that element of praise. You know, I shared that my father would tell other people that I was a great son and I was going to make great things out of myself. But see, I never heard those words. And so that was missing from my life growing up. But I still love my mother and father as much or more than anyone. And then we need the purpose or destiny in our life. You know, Rick Warren wrote that whole book on purpose-driven life. And we need to know that we have a purpose. We all have a purpose in life. And from early on, if we are in the right atmosphere that God has taught our parents, then they should be telling us God has a plan for your life. He has a purpose for your life. So that when we reach this point of, you know, some call it accountability, but when we begin to get our ideas for ourselves, that we begin to realize that I no longer lean into my parents, but I begin to lean into God because He has purpose for my life. And that's been taught to us as we grew up as children. And so many times these things that's not the way that we grew up, and we were missing these. And so if any of these things we're missing at all, then we end up with a wound. And wounds can cause love deficits. And so what you see there, if you follow this cycle of pain around, you see all these things that we are supposed to have. And so if any of them are missing, it develops this wound, and we talked about that last week. In other words, we're starved for love. You see there at the bottom of the page, I put, everyone has a need to be needed. Everyone has a need to be needed. An unmet need makes a person sick. A need met makes a person well. And so, you know, there was a comment at the end of the teaching last week that about coping mechanisms, and right here is where it all begins, that we have to go back, and many times we're not even able to identify this because we'll say things like, oh, I had loving parents and they loved me, and they surely probably did as well as they knew how. But if any of these things were missing, wounds can be created. And these are emotional wounds, basically, right here that I'm talking about. This doesn't take into account the physical or sexual or all the other type of abuse that happened to us and that happens to people on a daily basis now. And so when that wound develops because of one of these things that we're missing as children, then we begin to develop negative thought patterns. And that's where these strongholds begin to take root. And you could describe that as ungodly beliefs, mental strongholds, strong deceiving holds, the lies that develop in our mind. And see, ideally, whenever one of these wounds develop, then we need to know what is going on there. But as children, we don't know how to respond. And so if we have someone that's saying, you're just stupid, are you never going to get it? You know, what's wrong with you? Don't you understand anything? Are you ignorant? Or all these type things? Then we begin to believe these negative thought patterns. Well, apparently I'm stupid. There is this grown-up person that is saying these things to me, and I'm just a child, and these things are happening to me. And so perhaps what they're saying is true. And so these things take root like a seed that's being planted there. And see, what you would like to see happen is that we have godly parents who, when things like that happen and we see that a child has been harmed some way emotionally, that parent can begin to model forgiveness and love and all these different things, and they would come to us and say, I am so sorry that I hurt your feelings that way. You're not stupid at all. You're not smart at all. Because, you know, we all make mistakes. We're not perfect. But see, when those things are not modeled that way, then these things begin to take hold in our life, and these negative thought patterns begin to take place. And on the back of your sheet there, I put in a passage there where Jesus was talking to the Pharisees and the scribes and the teachers, and he had been sharing this parable with them about the blind leading the blind, and he called them blind guides, and he was trying to say, how are you going How are you going to lead other people when you don't know how to lead yourself? And so then he went on to say there in Luke chapter 6, he said, there's no good tree which produces bad fruit, nor on the other hand a bad tree which produces good fruit. For each tree is known by its fruit. For men do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they pick grapes from a briar bush. The good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth what is good, and the evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth what is evil. For his mouth speaks from that which fills his heart. And so Jack Frost, he made the comment, he said, good root, good fruit. Bad root, bad fruit. And so his point was that as these lies develop in us, as we said last week, we begin to develop these masks on the outside. But when things happen in our lives, it brings all that stuff out. And it's like the passage that talks about, it's out of the heart is where these things come. Like our diagram there. It's out of the heart. I mean, we can act good in all the right situations, but when our buttons get pushed, it's out of the heart. And so if there's that bad root in there from something that's taken root long ago that we may not even begin to identify, then that's when it begins to come out because there's a bad root that needs to be dealt with. But see, there's a danger there, and there's what I would call a pivot point, because many times at that particular place, we can take on the idea, well, that's just the way I've always been. Because see, it's deep-rooted in there. Bad fruit, bad root, bad fruit. Good root, good fruit. And so one of the visual examples that Jack gave is he was speaking with a man who was flying across the desert of Africa, and he saw down in the middle of this wide open desert, I mean, nothing but sand, but all of a sudden he saw like this big oasis, and it was just green, and there was trees, and just as green as it could be, and everything around it was just totally desert in the middle of Africa. And so he called on the flight attendant, and she came over, and he said, what is this here? All that desert, and then that great big oasis there that's just totally green and blooming with flowers and trees and everything. And she said, well, the government was drilling for oil, and they hit an underground river. And so they decided that they would just put in a 1-mile irrigation system and turn the sprinklers on and not plant any seed and see what happened. And so for 1 square mile, they put all those sprinkler heads, and they turned that irrigation system on, and they just let it run and run and run, and they didn't do anything but let the water run. And it produced this great, beautiful oasis that came from nowhere, because, see, the seed was down in there. And so then they turned it off, and everything died, and it went back to desert land again. And so the point is that, we have this stuff down in there, and until we get in the right situation, somebody turns the water on in our life, right? And so then we either go off in anger, we can go off in rage, we can act out and go drink, we can use drugs, we can go into pornography, we can eat. There's still stuff in me that God's still working out, that I still realize that something in there is going on, and I'll need a candy bar, or I'll need something, and I find myself that I'm comfort eating because somebody touched something in me. And see, what's important here to also know as we walk through this is that when we have these things that go on in our life and they trigger us and they turn the water on, so to speak, or Miracle Grow fertilizer, all of a sudden we're around this certain person and here it comes. It just all comes out. What we have to realize is that it may not be the other person. I've had conversations with a good friend of mine many, many times that, when I'm around a certain person, it's all I can do to just keep my calm. But God has taught me over the year, it's changed a different direction to where now I begin to look at it. Well, it may not be that person at all. There's probably something in me. Why is it triggering something to me? Jesus was able to model this better than any example that we have. And we know that he was real and he was true and he walked and he was crucified and all these other things. But even in the midst of his suffering and his pain, he was able to act like himself. In the middle of being beat, in the middle of being crucified, he was able to say, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Because, see, he had made the comment that, that the enemy was coming after him, but that he said, he has nothing in me. He has no hold on me. And so, see, he was able to act like who he was and other people not push his buttons. And so he's the perfect example of modeling that there was no bitter root strongholds in him at all. And so there were several definitions in this study that Jack did. He talked about strongholds, and he gave one by John Sanford, and it said, a habit structure of thought is how a stronghold develops. An act repeated so often, it's involuntary. There is no new decision of mind each time the act is performed. Example, writing with a pencil. You had to think about it the first time, but now hardly at all. You just write with it. Using a fork or a spoon or eating. Or you could take, for instance, whenever I was a smoker. If you have ever smoked, and I mean, it just was automatic. You know, if you got in the car, the first thing you did was you lit up a cigarette. Get up of a morning, you light a cigarette. You know, after you eat a good meal, you know, you find where's the nearest smoking area, I want to go out and smoke. And that's just what you did. And you smoked so long that it took no new decision in mind, you just did it. And I remember when I quit smoking that for the longest time, I would get in the car and the first thing I would do is I would be kind of reaching as if that's what I was going to do. And see, there was this habit, structure of thought that had developed in my mind that probably was not demonic at all, but it had become a habit to the point that it took no new decision of mine for me to do that. And see, many of our responses that you could go and you could begin to make a list is like, when every time that happens, I do this, I do that, I do that. And so, see, that develops this habit in us that it no longer takes any thought. And see, that's part of the problem with the healing process is it's so ingrained, and we'll get to that in a minute, that we really don't think about changing our thought process. And so, see, for Christian people and in ministries like this and Celebrating Freedom, and you've heard of deliverance ministries and all these other things, and where people go and they cast out demons and they pray for people to all these things come out of them and be delivered and freed. And that happened in my life over and over again. And, you know, it was like sin, confess, relapse, blah, blah, blah. And it was this vicious cycle that just kept going on and on and on. And you'd have preachers pray for you and deacons pray for you, and you'd have them anoint you with oil, and they'd cast these things and pray against these spirits of this spirit of that, and all these different things. And I'm not saying that those things in themselves are bad, but if in fact that those things were demonic and they were cast out, but that habit structure of thought is still there. And if we have not changed or are not willing to change that habit, then it's going to come right back. The water will be turned back on and it will grow. It's like fasting, or if you're trying to fast or whatever, and I mean, or if you're trying to diet or whatever, food, it talks to you, right? You know when there's ice cream in the freezer. You know there was cookies in the freezer. And you know right where the deli aisle is at Food City and all these different things. And we know where those things are. And if we're trying to war against something that's a habit in our life, those things will talk to us. Drinking was a terrible thing for me. I knew exactly when the beer stores closed. And it was such a habit structure of thought that, you know, when it became midnight, it was the case for me when those stores closed. And you could almost hear the tick-tock in my mind. You know, are you going to go? Or are you going to stay here? Are you going to go and get another six-pack or a case or whatever? And so those things talk to us because they're so ingrained as a habit structure of thought. Francis Frangipan called it a fortress of thought. And then, as I said earlier, Jack says all strongholds are not demonic. A stronghold in itself is not demonic. It's a fortress of thought. You can cast out the demonic influence, but the thoughts can come back. So see, for those of us who may have struggled with, why can't I quit this? Why can't I quit that? And we've had all the prayer support in the world, but we've never taken control of our mind. Or we've never realized what was that wound, what was missing in me. In other words, a love deficit can cause us to get in all kind of wrong relationships. It can cause us to use alcohol every time somebody hurts our feelings. A parent that rejected us, I mean, anytime we feel rejected by a boss or whatever, we can go drink or use or eat or all these, or work. You know, I've gone through so many of these things that many times clutter would just set me off. You know, if I'm in a situation where there's too much clutter, then my coping mechanism was I've got to do mass cleaning. All these things that we do to cope with these different things that have built up inside of us. And so then Mike Bickle described it as a collection of thoughts of lies against what God has revealed about himself or about you. And so see, this is for Christ followers, this definition here. I mean, if we are followers of Jesus, then we have what Jesus taught as our grid, as our foundation, as our baseline. And we know that he said, I love you. I love you so much that I came into the world. And so if we're feeling like nobody loves us, then see, that's a thought structure that's trying to take place against the truth of God. And see, look at what Paul, when he wrote to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians, and he wrote to them and the surrounding people that was there, and as he was getting ready to wrap up that letter, he was saying, we walk in the flesh, but we don't war according to the flesh, for the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. And see, that's talking about the thought processes there, ways we think. And he says, we're destroying speculations, or all these different imaginations and ideas, and everything raised up against the knowledge of God. And see, and so that's what he's talking about. These thoughts, if we're Christians, they begin to raise themselves up above the knowledge of God. And see, that's why we have so much trouble at times saying, I just don't feel like God's there. Because these things have raised themselves up above what the truth of God is. And so I think I've said this before, but I went through this process where I really began to say, I want to understand the truth and I want to live by the truth, even if it didn't feel like it. Because feelings come in the middle of that. And feelings can lie to us. They are not always true. Like if we're feeling unloved, it's a feeling, but we know that God loves us. And so see, that's a thought process that's trying to raise itself up against the knowledge of God, like Paul was talking about that. And he went on to say that they took every thought captive. And so see, I went through a point in my healing process that I began to speak out loud. You know, I didn't feel loved, but I'd say, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Or I would know these truths, and even if I didn't feel it at the time, I would say them out loud. And see, I'm not trying to give you a pattern or a formula here. I'm telling you how God worked in my life. But the common foundation is that these lies, these strongholds that have taken root in our life, we either demolish them with truth, change the thinking in our mind, or we embrace them as lies and they begin to grow, like it said, bad fruit. And so you see, they begin to grow one way or the other. And so what he went on to talk about in this cycle of pain is that these negative thought patterns, then they lead to sin or disobedience, which, you know, we've spent time talking about that word sin. And we've all done that, and we're all on level ground there. We're all the same. But we can say that, you know, because we did this and because we did that, that led us down this path, and we began to be disobedient to parents, to our bosses, to our spouses, to God, and we began all these different sinful patterns. And so then that led us to what he described as darkness or self-deception. We began to deceive ourselves in who we really were created to be. You know, and this was my life, spiraling straight down. I mean, there's a proverb that said, there's a way that seems right to a man, but in its end it leads to death. And see, my whole focus was on what I was thinking, and I was embracing hurt and pain and lies that I had believed all my life, and they were just taking me farther and farther down a road of darkness and self-deception. And so then what happens, and I was producing all this fruit in my life, but it was all ugly fruit. Yeah. See, like Jesus said, there's good fruit and there's bad fruit, and it comes from the root. Good root, good fruit. Bad root, bad fruit. And so all this hurt and pain that had happened in my life that I had wrongly interpreted what it was, it had me right in the middle of this cycle of pain. And then at this point, there are things that I believe in the spirit realm that could go to demonic influence. But see, everything up to here, it's thought patterns. It's not necessarily demonic. It's just habits that we've developed that are unhealthy habits. And see, I believe that the enemy continues to feed those lies. But there can reach a point to where it becomes totally demonic. And you see pictures of that in the news all the time and stories about all those times where it's progressed this far. And people believe lies that it's okay to just slaughter people. And so it's gone totally to the point then that it's way over the deep end of the demonic. And see, and even if you skip this part about the demonic, then what happens is we get in this vicious cycle, and then the wound gets bigger. You know, we've been hurt somewhere in our past, whether it was our adult life or our childhood, and we've never dealt with that wound that led to these thought patterns or habits. And so then somebody else comes along, and then they hurt us in that same wound, right? And then that whole wound is opened up again, and then it becomes a larger wound. And then what happens? Then we believe bigger lies. Well, maybe I really won't ever amount to something. Now I'm an adult. I didn't think I would amount to anything as a child, but now this wound that I didn't even know was a wound has been opened again, and I really may stink at life. Maybe it's true, and I begin to believe a bigger lie. And so then I go on to these other, bigger thoughts and expand it on out, and it continues to grow. And I was talking with Todd there earlier, and he talked about the picture he had seen of teaching of strongholds, and then the picture that somebody had described in a teaching of strangleholds, where you literally can't hardly get free at all from it. And so the whole vicious cycle continues. And it starts all over again, and then maybe the wound even gets bigger, or there's a different wound. And we get in this cycle to where it seems like we reach the point that all of our choices are bad. And then if you're like me, you reach this point to where you totally believe the lies and you want to take your life and just end it all, which is just silly. It's self-centered, and it was extremely selfish for me to think that way. But I had believed, I had followed this cycle to a T. And so that whole thing can continue to just grow and grow and grow. So whatever's in us, whatever hints that we're getting on what comes out, like, I wasn't really angry at you, I just went off. There's a root in there that needs to be dealt with, where some lies may have been planted that fully hasn't been healed. And so how do we begin healing? Jack made the comment that 50% of this is probably in our mind. And then, of course, he's speaking from a Christian perspective, which that's what I follow as well, that, making a decision in our mind is probably 50% of it, and then trusting the Spirit of the Holy Spirit in Jesus to heal the rest. And see, I believe that is what was modeled in my life. But see, that 50% is like a ton of bricks. I mean, we typically can't muster up 50% to change our thinking, because we'll usually sit on the fence and we're like, I just can't believe that somebody would love me. I really just can't believe that I could amount to something in my lifetime. I just really, really can't believe that God has a plan for my life. And so we stay stuck right there. But then we go to a conference or somewhere, and then somebody prays for us, and we're like, yay, it's good. And we made a commitment, and we feel clean for a little while, and then Monday morning comes, and it's like, there's those thought patterns again. And see, that's why I believe you couple what I'm talking about here with what Paul said in the letter of Romans, and he said, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Until we are willing to change our stinking thinking. See, this is foundational. I mean, if you've been coming to Celebrating Freedom for a while, and you've been in this vicious cycle, and you go in a group and you say the same thing week in and week out, somebody should look at you with a little more wisdom, maturity, and I'm not trying to be ugly, but say, look, when are you going to change the way you think? That is not true about you. Maybe they need to just shake us once in a while. But until we choose to change the way we think and line it up with what God's truth for us is, if we're Christians, we're going to stay right there in that vicious cycle. Paul went on to talk about in his letter to the Ephesians, and he said, lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted. It's dying anyway, basically he's saying. And be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Be renewed in the spirit of your mind. And see, I believe there's a lot of truth in that. That until we're willing to change, I'm going to hammer that home. Until we are willing to change the way we think. Even if it doesn't feel like it, if we're willing to say, okay, God does love me. Nobody else does, but Okay, God does. I look in the mirror, I do not feel fearfully and wonderfully made. Well, I believe that that might be true of what God thinks of me. So I'm at least going to hang on to that. And so we grab hold of what the promises that Jesus gave us, and we walk forward in those truths, and I am convinced that we will find healing. And see, I believe that these habits of thoughts, when we define them, we should write them down, maybe journal them, bounce them off of people. Why do I always think like this? What is it? What is that root? And we're not looking for this to go on to dig up old graves and just to glorify and all these things that happen to us. We're looking at them for understanding. And I said it last week, and I'll say it again, that, I've uncovered a lot of stuff. Every person in the world has wounds. Everybody does. Stuff happens. People hurt us. We hurt people. That's life. And so when we realize these things, it's like light bulbs going off. Oh, now I know why I react that way. Now I know why I act that way. Now I know why when this happens, I can predict that I'm going to do that. If somebody cuts me off in traffic, years ago, I was just like most people, road rage. I would want to get after them and do all I could. But see, God's healed me from that. It was my issue. Is their ignorance. But see, how am I going to deal with it? And see, these light bulbs go off in us, and we're like, okay, I've got all this stuff that's just waiting to spew out of me. And when we begin to realize that there are some of those roots as to why these things happen, then we go back to that 50%. Am I willing to make a decision? Am I willing to decide that I want to change the way I think? We talk about the Bible as Christians and all these type things, and then we get these ideas that Paul and Jesus said, and it's like they don't even matter. But it's easy to say, I'm a Jesus follower, but that whole thing there, I don't know about that. And the idea of changing your way of thinking, and we would have to ask ourselves, if we are truly Jesus followers and we haven't changed our way of thinking, how's that worked? Why are we still here? I mean, it's good to be here and surrounded by people. It's fabulous and it's awesome. But when we find these truths, we get to this point of freedom, and that I'm telling you, I'll never be perfect, but I have come so far in understanding how God sees me. And Satan, he has no power in my life. He has no authority in my life. I'm not afraid of him. Jesus took him down, and there's nothing he can bring at me that I have not been able to withstand if he brought something against me. I try not to give him any brain time that I'm being attacked. When we say the devil's after me, really? Maybe. I don't know. I did a teaching on that. Maybe you want to check out the podcast and a couple months ago and really dug into what James talked about. It's our own desires a lot of times, that root stuff that brings it out of us. It's our own desires, that lust, that bring that stuff out. So anyway, I hope that helps us to understand that these strongholds, habit structures of thought, no new decision of mind. We do these things. Where do they come from? Talk about this in your small group. Challenge each other. There's no condemnation for those that are in Christ Jesus. Share your story. Identify and talk about it. Those are your talking points for walking it out and freedom points. Well, God, I'm so thankful that you want to reveal these things to us, and how you're willing to teach us and walk alongside of us, and it just takes the whole wind out of what the enemy's desires are. And so, Lord, whatever you have shown us in this time, I pray that we would have the courage to talk it out. I pray that you would reveal the root sources of pain, and then shine light on that. And God, that it would bring healing. And Lord, that we would just be able to love others the way that you modeled that. And we thank you so much for your love, and we praise you in the name of Jesus. Amen.